This week, we'll be taking a look at the impact monster Mayhem has had on the meta and trying out one of the new decks.
そして負けた者への罰ゲーム償いの瞬間だぜマインドクラッシュ
So this week we have two main topics I'm looking to cover. Up first, we're going to look at the new decks from the Battles of Legends set that just came out, and I want to highlight some of the decks that I think will be most relevant for the NAWCQ. And then after that, I actually played one of the decks this week for a lot of testing and locals, and we're going to take a look at my experience playing that deck and see what my thoughts were. Starting off today, I want to take a look at one of the decks that I think will be the most impactful of all the new cards released from the Monster Mayhem set, and that is Orcust. With the introduction of Galatea I, Orcust now has the means to get any of their monsters into the graveyard at any time, and potentially get an Orcust monster that's clogging their hand into the graveyard. The introduction of this card definitely brings Orcust up to a more modern standard and makes it more competitive with some of the other decks in the meta right now. Orcust has the unfortunate situation where it loses really hard to Lancia and Bystials, which are both meta relevant because of other decks right now. I think if Orcust was the best deck, people would probably still play Bystials, but people would definitely not be playing Lancia. It's similar to Crystron in that way. Bystials have kind of become a standard of the game now due to the introduction of Fiendsmith last year, not only being able to interrupt your opponent's Fiendsmith cards, but potentially start yours by putting a free body on field, and 2, if it's Magnemut, is really strong, and it just so happens that Magnemut target Harporer could be game ending for Orcust. Specifically in regards to Malice too, Impulse on Harporer is also a very strong interaction that could also end the game for your Orcust opponent. While I don't think pure Orcust is really an option, considering all of the things I just listed, playing Orcust with a secondary engine is very strong, and I think it's something that a lot of people will see and has already been seeing results in the first weekend of its release. Fiendsmith Orcust is something that people have been playing and testing, as whenever there's a new deck and it's slightly underneath the power level needed, people will just put Fiendsmith cards in because it's so easy to access in every deck. And while I think a deck that can make Caesar is a powerful deck, I think there are better uses of the Orcust engine that are more synergistic than the Fiendsmith engine. Orcust Azamina has been a rogue deck for a little while. I've seen it at some regionals, and I think with the new cards it only gets better. There are inherent synergies between the Azamina engine and the Orcust engine. Azamina is an engine that needs to put multiple cards in the graveyard to continue playing, and can help access things like a free Omni Negate, which is obviously very strong. These cards also do give Orcust some additional link material that can be utilized to make the new Link 4, which is a part of the end board that is very hard to beat. It's a non-targeting snatch steal. And going Diabellstar pitch Harporer is a very threatening start to a turn. However, me personally, I think the best use of the Orcust cards is with the TCG exclusive Mitsurugi engine. Orcust and Mitsurugi synergize insanely well, and it's something we haven't been able to see because Mitsurugi is a TCG exclusive, so the OCG hasn't been able to experiment with, but I think this is going to be one of the strongest decks going into the NAWCQ. With the introduction of normal summoning Girsu or Harporer now get you full access to your entire Orcust engine and your entire Mitsurugi engine through the use of King of Feral Imps. The end result is a board that is much more layered than previous Mitsurugi boards in my opinion, with a lot of interaction in the front row, the back row, and the graveyard. Your 1-card combo now ends on the send off Dingirsu, snatch steal off the new Orcust Link 4, Babel, which makes all the Orcust cards really hard to interact with in the graveyard and can potentially turn off Bystials, the Orcust Crescendo Counter Trap, and in addition you also get full access to all the Mitsurugi cards, including Futsu, both of the interactions off Murakumo, and you can even main deck the Mitsurugi Trap if you choose to. These two engines pair really well with each other, and when you consider the fact that you can play cards like Dominus Impulse, which doesn't conflict with either engine when used from the hand, Zombie Vampire, which gives you a lot of free information about your opponent's deck, you can see why it's a very strong deck going into the NAWCQ. I think this deck really does contend with Raziel as the best way to play Mitsurugi, and has already gotten a top 8 placement at a regional this weekend, and I think this is just one of the first of many results. Up next, I want to highlight one of my favorite decks of the new set, Fiendsmith P.U.N.K. As I've said in past videos, I'm a huge fan of the P.U.N.K cards, and I think this deck is really cool. However, I do not think it's anywhere near the same tier as Orcust Mitsurugi or some of the previous top decks that we've had in the format, such as Raziel Mitsurugi or Malice. To me, this deck feels more on the tier 2 level, but I do think it will take like 1 to 2 top cut spots in the NAWCQ. The strength of Fiendsmith Punk, in my opinion, is its ability to play through hand traps. It doesn't care too bad about draw. There's usually lines to play around through Ash. Both engines set up protection from Nibiru, and other hand traps at that point aren't as big of a deal. This deck also does access its non-engine pretty efficiently, drawing up to 4 cards on your own turn, and even drawing on your opponent's turn as well, which is obviously very strong. This leads to a very high ceiling deck with a strong end board that consists of multiple negates and different forms of interruption. A typical end board for this deck will consist of Caesar, which is obviously one of the strongest cards of the format. The new Z's that Punk got, it's called Punk Jam Fever, and it's a monster negate, which is very strong. The deck can also end on things like IP and SP. It can also end on Jurishin, which is the new level 11 Psychic Synchro that was introduced in Alliance Insight. That card is very strong in my opinion. It just blows up your opponent's monsters or back row just by paying 1500 life points on your opponent's turn, and that can also trigger the Punk Field spell to draw a card because it is a psychic monster. And like I said before, you also get to draw a lot of cards because of things like Necroquip and the Punk Field spell. You can draw up to 4 cards on your turn, like I said. However, in my opinion, this deck has 2 weaknesses that I want to highlight. First of Fiendsmith Punk's weaknesses, in my opinion, is the difference between 1-card combos and 2-card combos in this deck. When looking at decks in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, a lot of people base the strength of a deck off of its 1-card combo. As we all know, 1 X-Ryziel, 1 Malice Dormouse. That does pretty much everything you need. And while extenders help you play through interaction, when uninterrupted, your 1-card combo usually gets you to your full end board with all the pieces that you would need to win the game. However, in my opinion, from when I was playing the deck, this can't really be said about Fiendsmith Punk. It does feel like a 2-card combo deck in most instances. There are ways to get the strong end boards with Fiendsmith Punk through 1-card combos, but they usually play really bad into things like Nibiru. Usually the way you get to the strongest end boards with 1-card combos is sacrificing the Jam Fever and not leaving it on board for a monster negate. And if that happens and you get Nibiru'd, you pass your turn pretty much. In a lot of instances with 1-card combos, you're either choosing to leave Jam Fever on your field and not lose to Nibiru, or choosing to use the effect to draw a card and then linking it off to get into Fiendsmith combo, in which case you would definitely lose to Nibiru. However, the one kind of upside you could say is that if you only have 1-card combo, that means the other 4 cards in your hand are non-engine, which can definitely make things a little better for you, but are still not ideal, obviously. However, have access to any other piece of engine does get you to the full end board with the Fiendsmith combo, even if you don't draw a Fiendsmith exactly. So I do think that the end boards this deck can produce are still very strong and worth considering for sure. However, the real weakness of this deck, in my opinion, is Fuga Loss. Both of these engines summon from the deck and extra deck a lot, and Fuga Loss can really hurt. You can play all the outs you want, you can play cross out, you can play called by, you can play 3 Ash, but it still doesn't matter because sometimes you won't draw them and your opponent will draw Fuga Loss, and that can really end your turn. In these situations, when you get hit with Fuga, you can usually set up like Requiem into the Lacrima, into the Fiendsmith trap, so you can get Ascend on your opponent's turn, which is fine. Sometimes if you draw enough, you can set up Sharkusai plus a level 8 to synchro into Amazing Dragon on your opponent's turn, which bounces cards to hand, which is also a nice form of interruption. But those still require you to give your opponent multiple draws into Fuga, which is just not ideal, obviously, especially for interruptions that aren't really that strong. While these do sound discouraging, I don't mean to turn people off from playing Fiendsmith Punk. I do think that this deck is still a strong choice for the NAWCQ format, and I think it has access to a lot of cards that other decks don't have access to that make it worth considering for sure. For example, this deck is pretty good at going second in my opinion. Fiendsmith Engine is really nice at playing into a detonator, especially if you play Chaos Angel. 1 Engraver sets up Chaos Angel without any effects on field activating, which is very nice. This deck also really easily makes Psychic and Punisher, which in my opinion is one of the best board breaker and OTK cards that we have in the format. Not a lot of decks are able to make the most out of that card, which is one of the reasons why I think Punk has a pretty good time going second. Lastly, I want to talk about the other decks that got support from this set. I haven't seen a lot of experimentation, and maybe aren't as strong, maybe are like local, regional level decks, but I still think are worth highlighting. Knight and Fabled both got really strong new support that have a lot of potential, There have been people testing these decks using Fiendsmith as a supplemental engine, and while I think these are cool options, I think there are just better ways to use the Fiendsmith engine. I don't see why there's really a reason to play Fiendsmith Gemini or Fiendsmith Fabled when you could play like Punk I was just talking about, or Live Twin, which is a very strong way to use the Fiendsmith engine. They could obviously just be used in Mitsurugi and Raizio, which are just stronger engines as well. Dragon Maid is a deck that got some new cards, which also have a bit of potential, but I don't think it really does enough. This deck can go second pretty well because it has easy access to Tenpai cards, but I don't think it has what it needs to play through the abundance of hand traps that are featured in most decks at the moment. Lastly, there have been some people playing the new Necroz cards in Mitsurugi Raizio. You can use them to set up Necroz of Trishula on your opponent's turn, which is pretty strong, but I think mostly you would prefer the consistency of just regular Mitsurugi Raizio as opposed to a high ceiling that has more bricks. Now I want to take some time to talk about my experience playing one of the new decks. As I said before in past videos, I played Fiendsmith Punk this week. After I got my hands on a box and a couple of the extra cards that I was missing, I took some time to build the deck and prep it to play at locals this week. Unfortunately, I only got to play it at one local though. The cards were not legal at locals on Thursday, unfortunately. So I only got to play it on a local on Friday, which was a pretty short local, and I wasn't able to get that much good footage. But I'll work with what we have. Despite only playing it at one local though, I did test the deck a lot in casual play and practice matches with a bunch of my friends, so I do think I have a good amount of experience testing the deck. In addition, I also did talk to some of my friends who are planning on bringing this deck to Nats, just to get a better idea of what people who are more dedicated to the strategy are thinking about it as well, and get some additional perspective. The first thing I noticed this deck was the big issue that I mentioned when I was talking about it in the last section, which is the problems the deck has with FUA. Under FUA, you really do have to commit a lot of cards to make anything worthwhile, and usually if your opponent is playing a deck with a lot of hand traps, they're stopping you, and if your opponent isn't playing a lot of hand traps and they're playing one of the decks that is just playing like 9 hand traps, like 6 Charmies and 3 Jolls, they're just going to be drawing into cards that'll help them break the board. Stuff like Crossout, Called by Talents, and just insane amounts of engine. However, I did also really enjoy playing this deck, and I think it's something I could see myself playing some more. Probably after Nats, I might take a little bit of a break from playing Malice. I've been playing it pretty much every week since December, so it might be a little refreshing to try something new for a while. I'm also kind of expecting there to be a ban list right after Worlds, and I don't expect Malice to get away unscathed, unfortunately. One of the things I really like about this deck is it kind of feels like you're trying to solve a puzzle all the time to get to the end board that you want. This is one of the things I think I enjoy about Malice too. The way I think about the game when I have like the cards in my hand and I'm trying to play into either build a board or break my opponent's board, I kind of think about the game like a puzzle almost. 5 pieces of the puzzle in my hand, and the end board is the completed puzzle. And I try to think, how will these 5 pieces get me to where I need to be, if that makes sense. The thing I really like about Malice is all there is like the 1 card YouTube combo where 1 Dormouse converts to the Omni Negate and the Firewall and the 2 Malice Links and the Trap and the March Hare in your hand. And that's awesome. And that's like obviously one of the strengths of this deck. However, a lot of the time, that's not actually what happens, because you're playing against another person who has 5 cards in their hand. Potentially 6 or 7 or 8 if they have a Charmy too. You're trying to figure out how these cards get you to the Firewall and the Allied Code and the monsters and the traps and stuff, but you're also trying to figure out how to get there through the Ash Blossom that your opponent has, and the Imperm and the Impulse and all those cards. And you're also trying to figure out things like, well, if I can't get there, what's the best thing I can do instead? Maybe I'm supposed to end on Cryptor. Maybe I'm supposed to end on Firewall plus Cryptor. Maybe it's IP. Maybe it's Ransom with the spell. So there's just a lot of variation. That's something that I didn't like when I tried to play Raziel, because the answer was always Detonator Cross. And I kind of felt that way when I was playing the Punk deck, because I didn't realize how important it was to manage your resources when it comes to your tuner combinations and the levels you have access to. For those who don't know, Punk really only has 1 level 5 monster in Deer Note, That's really the only one you play, and it's a one of. But it's a really good card that summons another body back when it gets sent to grave, and you can usually chain block that too, and so it won't get hit with things like Impulse. It usually means that you're only making one Synchro 8 per turn. And pretty much every single instance you're making the Punk level 8 that searches for a level 3 Psychic monster and will usually trigger the field spell to draw you a card. Most of the time you're searching additional follow-up, but you can also search Ghost Ogre, which is kind of cute. I didn't really realize how important it was to manage things like the level 8s and the level 3s because the level 8 main deck monsters don't get access to other level 8s. Out of the three being Deer Note, Ogre Dance, and Rising Scale, none of them get access to each other. So you have to get access to those cards through other means like Sharakusai summoning the Rising Carp, and then Rising Carp summoning from deck. So a lot of times when I start my combo, I look at the cards I have access to and think, well, how can I get access to level 8s and tuners so I can make my board of the Jam Fever? And I was usually going for level 11 Synchro and not IP. Typically I was ending on the Jurishin. In addition, I was also trying to figure out when I should access Fiendsmith cards if I didn't draw them. Most of the time in Punk 1-card combos, it was really hard to try and isolate yourself from Nib and also get access to Fiendsmith and also get access to a level 11 Synchro. Usually I found myself having to pick between the Fiendsmith combo or the level 11 Synchro. Most of the time I picked Fiendsmith. It's an engine that cycles itself infinitely. The Fiendsmith engine also puts up 3 interactions instead of just 1 that you get out of the level 11 Synchro, because you get 2 Caesars and you get the Requiem Lacrima trap interruption. Another thing I noticed a lot while playing this deck is while it does have really easy access to its non-engine because you can draw so many cards on your own turn, it's also a bit deceiving because of how many Charmies you have to main deck. I was main decking 5, I was doing 2 Perulia and 3 Fua, and even still, a lot of the times I was drawing into them and they were just dead cards in my hand. Usually even like the time you access your draws, you're already done discarding cards for the turn, you've already used Foxy. You don't really get the value of, oh, this is a free card in my hand that I can get rid of. It's usually just a dead Charmy, and maybe you have the chance to discard it on turn 3. I said recently on my Twitter, which if you're not following, which I know most of you aren't because I have 3 followers, the ad's right here. I haven't, in my builds of Malice, I haven't been maining the Charmies. I've been siding the same ratios that I was playing in the main deck in my Punk deck, 2 Perulia, 3 Fua, and honestly, it's felt better than I expected. I explain it more on Twitter, but I think that would be a consideration for Fiendsmith Punk because of how often you access your engine. And in my opinion, it even has better game going second than Malice because of both the Fiendsmith cards and Psychic and Punisher. Malice really only has strength in going second when you're able to access Code Talker. However, one area where this deck definitely does not compare to Malice is its follow-up. This deck really can struggle on turn 3. As far as I know, there's no way for Punk Engine to recur itself. The field spell doesn't do it. None of the names really have effects in graveyards. So turn 3s are mostly just Fiendsmith. Usually you have to access your follow-up through searching it on the first turn by using like the level 8 Synchro to search for an additional Xiamen that you hold in your hand, or you draw into it over the course of your first turn, which obviously is nice, but that means you're not drawing in a non-engine to stop your opponent, which is kind of like a double-edged sword situation. This is mitigated a little bit by the Fiendsmith engine being able to infinitely loop itself. Accessing the Punk engine on turn 3 is pretty important when you have a card like Psychic and Punisher, which is just a crazy board breaking tool. Fiendsmith also doesn't really bridge into Punk, especially because the levels don't line up. Since Engravers is 6 and Lacrimas is 4, you can't really use them to make synchros. I thought about playing a Synchro 9 for a little bit, but there really aren't any good options. Your best one is like Shen, which is fine, but it's not really great into the current meta when Malice and Mitsurugi don't care too bad about Macrocosmos. So while I did enjoy playing this deck, I don't think I've been convinced. I'm pretty sure I'm still going to be playing Malice at Nationals. Like I said, I've been playing it since December, pretty much every week, multiple times a week. I'm just so comfortable with Malice at this point. I can do the lines in my sleep. On Thursday, actually, for the local, it was a tournament where the winner got a box. So like the entry was double, and I got third after not playing Malice in 2 weeks because I thought I was going to be able to play Fiends with Punk. It's just a deck that is very comfortable for me and comes naturally. And at an event like the NAWCQ, I want to be sure that I'm giving myself every advantage that I possibly can. Even though I am playing a deck that is a lot more represented and has a lot more cards that kind of hate it out, like Lancia and Chaos Hunter and all those other cards that the Malice players who watch have nightmares about. I'm very interested to see how the Punk cards develop though. I'm really excited about the generic Psychic cards that come out in Duelist Advance. Those cards seem really cool. I've seen a lot of people incorporate the Punk cards into that because the Almond is a Psychic, so it gives you another target off E-Telly, and both the Punk cards that you would play in the extra deck are Psychics, so they don't interfere with the lock. That is something I also want to tinker with after the NAWCQ. These cards were very interesting to me when they first got revealed, and I immediately opened DB and started messing around with all the different Psychic cards. Pretty sure I've read every single one, just trying to find cards that would be good in that deck. But for now, at least, still playing Malice. You guys are still stuck with me, and I think I've said all that I can say about the new decks coming out of this set. I think next week I want to talk a little bit about the state of Malice going into Nationals. Obviously pre-Duelist Advance, because that isn't out yet. Just looking at the deck and thinking of ways that Malice can be built to better suit it for the Nationals environment, where Lancia and where cards like that are going to be so prevalent just because of the sheer strength of the deck. I think there is some tech that hasn't been looked at by a lot of the top lists that I think is worth highlighting as ways to beat Lancia and making the deck a lot more resilient in post-sided games, so be on the lookout for that. But until then, thanks for joining me as always, and I'll see you next week.